From the Pacific Northwest, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I am Chris Gio. It is February 12th, 2016. We have a jam-packed show for you. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, forgive the audio quality if it's sounding a little bit subpar. We are still experiencing quite a few technical difficulties. I had a major piece of gear go out on me, sent it in for warranty repair, and here I am 10 days later. It's still not back, and it's very, very, very frustrating. But, of course, we pulled together whatever we can to put on a show for you, because the show must go on. So this evening, we're going to be speaking with a couple of really, really fascinating guests. The topics that we're going to cover is, I think we need to get into esoteric Hollywood, because it's something that we've talked about on the show here recently, mind control programming, et cetera, et cetera. Dyer is joining us. His website is jaysanalysis.com, and he's a regular contributor to the popular Activist Post, 21st Century Wire, Global Research, and the scholarly Soul of the East, as well as conducting numerous interviews with experts in fields ranging from espionage to history and economics. Was just taking a look at his website earlier. Great, great stuff over here. It looks like also a contributor to Weird Stuff magazine. Freeman Fly and Jamie put that together. So, Jay, do we have you on?
Yes, you do.
Excellent. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Your website is jaysanalysis.com. Any other websites you'd like to point the audience to?
No, that's really it. That's where you can find all my material.
Okay, excellent. So I see here esoteric Hollywood, and we've talked about predictive programming, and we've had, I don't remember the name of the guest on, Robert Sullivan,
yes,
who did a book called, I don't know why the name of the book eludes me, but Cinema Symbolism. Cinema Symbolism in Hollywood. I've always been really, really, really fascinated with that topic. So where do we begin on the topic of esoteric Hollywood?
Well, a good place to begin is the place that I kind of began, and that's most of us probably around our age, if you're, in your 30s or 40s, is the 80s. And, there's so many films that we grew up with in the 80s, like The Never-Ending Story or Labyrinth, that have this veneer of silliness and of the absurd, and what you would think would be directed, primarily at something simplistic or towards young adolescents. But actually, there's quite a bit of esoterica involved in these films, especially Jim Henson movies like The Dark Crystal. So when I started Jay's Analysis, that's kind of where I started, was in these, sort of cult following 80s films that we all grew up with. And it just kind of blossomed out from there. So I just started doing analyses of what I saw in films. And as I got more traction, I started expanding out into reviewing, more modern films, things that are kind of the recent blockbusters. And after you do this for a long time, you start noticing that, there really are patterns, there really are coordinated numerological symbols, esoteric symbols that, really continue through film from the get-go. So the more you dive into this, it's just a deeper and deeper rabbit hole, and ultimately it's resulted in me writing a book on the topic.
Fascinating. Now, I don't want to make this about the topic of flat Earth, because I know flat Earth is pretty taboo in a lot of circles, but I noticed that Activist Post recently started picking up on that particular topic, which brings to mind the esoteric symbolism within the Truman Show. Have you had a chance to investigate that?
I did actually do an episode of my show. I do a podcast, Esoteric Hollywood, as well, and I did do an episode on the Truman Show. And in fact, the Truman Show is curiously full of Masonic symbolism. If you remember at the beginning, there's a light that falls from the dome, and the light is specifically named Canis 9 and then Sirius. So we have the immediate reference at the beginning of that to Sirius, which is, of course, the dog star that plays prominently in Masonic mythology. But as you go throughout the film, you'll see the twin pillars and so forth. And I think what that storyline is telling us is that Ed Harris's character as kind of the panopticon controller is more of a Gnostic kind of demiurge feature. It's sort of the Wizard of Oz man behind the curtain. And from the Gnostic or Masonic perspective, the idea would be that, well, there's not really a deity. There's rather just blind chaos, and the deity that we project out there in that view is something that's psychological. So this would be kind of hinting at the ideas of Feuerbach, who is a famous German philosopher who influenced Karl Marx. And Feuerbach's philosophy said that God is really just a projection of our own human archetypes and desires. And so we grew up with a father, and so therefore we kind of project a father figure out into space. And I think that for the most part, that is the kind of secret message of Masonry, is kind of an either atheistic or Gnostic illuminism, right? Where you have the idea that ultimately we are our own gods. And that's pretty much what's going on in the Truman Show. That's the final scene where Truman realizes that his reality is a construct, and he climbs that staircase, which is so enigmatic and so, recalls to mind the Masonic, the staircase in so many of the Masonic symbols. And that's those steps to enlightenment, right? That's the pathway, according to the Gnostic perspective, of illumination. So I think that Truman Show is definitely an illuminist film, and very much something that demonstrates revelation of the method, that perspective of the establishment and the occult elite showing us, their perspective of the world through so much of our Hollywood complex.
Well, the story seems to be repeated throughout. There was another film, Dark City. I don't know if you had a chance to look at that one. And, of course, The Matrix, the most famous one.
Yeah, I have an written analysis of both The Matrix and Dark City. And I think Proyas's Dark City is interesting because it's borrowed directly from Metropolis. And so Fritz Lang's German Expressionist film is heavily occult, heavily esoteric. And if you watch the film, you know that there's all these hints at transhumanism, back at the turn of the century, which is quite curious given the fact that they create this robotic she-bitch, right, who's like sitting at the foot of a pentagram when she, comes alive. And so Fritz Lang's work was very instrumental, in terms of what Hitchcock would do. So German Expressionism is some of the first cinema to include actually quite a bit of satanic and occultic imagery, and then that would later influence British filmmakers like Hitchcock. But to your point about The Matrix and films like The Truman Show, there are a whole host of films that kind of contain this Platonic allegory of the cave narrative. And I have, as I said, analyses of both of those. If you watch The Matrix, you'll notice that a lot of people don't know this, but when Agent Smith shows Neo his passport, the date on the passport is 2001, 9/11/2001. And that film was made in 1998, I believe. So there you have one shining example of predictive programming. And I think that it's relevant in terms of 9/11 because you actually do see sort of false flag terror in The Matrix, especially in the second installment where they blow up the power station. And this is all done at the behest of the architect, right? Because the architect ultimately is kind of behind Neo. So that whole idea of the grand architect of the universe, that's straight out of Masonry. And reportedly Sean Connery was going to be who played the architect. And that's interesting because Connery features in so many Masonic films, such as Time Bandits or The Man Who Would Be King.
I think Sean Connery would have been a great choice for that role. I didn't know that. Now I have to see the film from another perspective. But what do you think the point of putting all this out there? For instance, you mentioned predictive programming with the passport. But what are the chances that anybody's going to even notice that or pick up on that? Or is that aimed at the subliminal mind?
It's aimed at the subconscious. You're absolutely correct there. So most this older strategy of subliminals and manipulation of archetypes goes back to psychological warfare and strategies that were developed, back in the 40s and 50s during wartime. Hitler, in his Mein Kampf, actually includes an extensive chapter at the end of the book that deals with different strategies of how you could propagandize. And it's very interesting if you read that because you'll notice that the strategies of Hitler, as well as the strategies of the Soviets and people like V.I. Lenin and the Bolsheviks and their agitation propaganda or agitprop, they caught on to the fact that you could manipulate the psyche through advertisements. And so both the fascists and the communists were sharing the exact same strategy of the mass global capitalists in terms of what would be modern advertising. And that's why you see the CIA coming out of the advertising world with the Robert Mullen Company and the J. Walter Thompson Company, all featuring all of these early OSS CIA people who would then go on to form that organization, which would deal heavily with media and propaganda, especially in things like Operation Mockingbird and so forth. So part of the reason that it's done, to answer your question, is to condition, right? So it's done over several decades and even over centuries in terms of the long-term strategies of the white papers and the globalists and the, Rockefeller Foundation and so forth. But in terms of the immediate examples of different films, it's done, I believe, on one level just to condition people, to get them ready for what's coming down the road so that they're more easily acceptable. They're more easily, they can accept what comes to them from the establishment, be it memes or trends or styles or whatever. And then on another level, it's done, I believe, because there are people in the establishment that are involved in, numerology and Kabbalah, the occult, things like this. And so for them, I think that it's viewed as a kind of ritual. And so you can ritually charge something when you line up all of these synchronicities, sort of done by your own hand. And then when you let it loose, the idea is that the intention of what your action is it's like a ritual. It's let loose into the subconscious. And that would include as well dates and times and seasons and calendars and numerology. And that's why you would have, for example, the date of September 11th, 2001 put into the film, that it's just the date that's shown. That would embed in people's subconscious. And so they would, even though people aren't, consciously picking up on this image, we know that scientifically speaking, the subconscious mind is able to pick up far more than the conscious mind. And it's all stored away, right? And it's there in your mind somewhere, even if you don't immediately recall it. In fact, there are studies that show that even infants are able to pick up things when they're, far prior to the use of reason, like we tend to think. They are actually storing the things that they're hearing. So with that being said, that's what the Pentagon and these different strategists, the RAND Corporation and these big think tanks, they've all wargamed this and they've studied it out, and they know the exact scientific ways to present these things so that people are conditioned and so that people are put under it's kind of like voodoo. It's like, being put under the spell of the Obey or the Vodun.
Wow. Well, there's one thing I know for sure about film, and that is that any scene that you see, every single detail is accounted for. Nothing is missed whatsoever. Well, every once in a while they might have the bloopers where you see one thing move to another direction. But for the most part, everything that's in a scene is put there on purpose. Yes. And accounted for. So would you say that the filmmakers are actually in on this, or is there some outside entity or force that is making suggestions, maybe be it a financier or somebody like that?
I would say all the above. And so, for example, for a lot of films that were done in the last 2 decades that portray the CIA, you have two guys who were main CIA liaisons between Hollywood and the government, and that would be Chase Brandon and Milt Bearden, both of whom were former CIA operatives. They then transitioned into Hollywood, as did another CIA operative, Melissa Mela, who worked with Angelina Jolie on the film Salt. But Chase Brandon and Milt Bearden worked on films like The Recruit or TV series like Alias by J.J. Abrams. And so what they would do is they would be there to, quote unquote, consult, but would recommend script changes, would recommend the use of this or that image here and there and so forth. And so there's very much a tight relationship between the two. There was a recent FOIA release that Tom Secker over at spyculture.com got a hold of, and he saw that in the Pentagon's budget for the last year, they had actually put money into messages that would be placed in films like, in TV shows like Cupcake Wars and American Idol. So when you're watching Cupcake Wars or American Idol, you're actually watching shows that have openly, and we now know, been influenced by military strategists and the intelligence apparatus. So all of TV is actually this way, and this is something I've been arguing for a long time because I did my master's thesis on this topic, and that's the relationship between film fiction and reality. And so it's very much a scientific strategy, as well as, I would say, at this deeper level, having occult meanings. It's everywhere. It's in pretty much any major blockbuster, and that to me suggests, a super, super tight, almost flip side of the same coin relationship between Hollywood and the CIA.
Well, it goes all the way up and down the line. I know one of the actors from a film called Toy Soldiers, and not the cartoon, but this was a film about a terrorist group that took over a university. Mm-hmm. And the original plot line was to have the terrorists be from another country. then the filmmakers wanted to use some tanks and they wanted to use some other military weapons, and the military said, sure, let's go ahead and we'll let you use this. Why don't you just change the script a little bit and make it this particular country instead of that country? Because it fit their political agenda. I speculate, and I don't have any solid evidence for this, but I speculate the same thing happened in Back to the Future. There's one particular scene where Doc Brown gets the plutonium from the Libyans. It was the Libyans, and it was right around the same time as the Lockerbie situation.
Yep.
I am willing to bet that the government came in and said, just change it over to the Libyans to push their political agenda.
Well, that's funny because, that's a Spielberg film, and Spielberg is very much aware of all this. In fact, if you go through the Spielberg canon, you can see quite consistently that he's utilized this whole technique of predictive programming and placing these kinds of messages in his films. In fact, he's a big fan of Philip K. Dick, and so he's made, he made Minority Report, which included this idea of predictive algorithms and predictive tracking. So that's something that Spielberg's all about. He's also been instrumental in promoting, the idea of aliens and so forth. And I would say that all the way back to Close Encounters, there's a technique he uses within the film that he got from people like Kubrick, another friend of his, whose films are, of course, obviously full of like everything. You couldn't find anybody better than Kubrick for this kind of stuff. Spielberg used in Close Encounters this technique of simulacrum, where you take smaller images of something, say a truck or a spaceship that's a child's toy, that's later going to be in, quote, real life later in the film. And what this is it's a technique, I would say, ultimately of magic, where you're kind of like voodoo, where you're taking, if you take somebody's possession in voodoo and then you tie it to the voodoo doll, right, you have like a mimicked or copied version of that person that stands in or represents them. And in the magical perspective, there's a real connection between the simulated object and the real thing. And so Spielberg's films show this consistently throughout, where, the children will be playing with toys, and then later you'll see those same objects later in the film in real life, like a spaceship or whatever. Now, so this is an actual technique. It sounds a little bit out there, but if you think about it, that's actually what the director himself is doing with a film. The director is putting together people into different scenes and construct them in a certain way. And then later that affects everyone's psyche. So therefore it's put into reality in terms of how it's put out there into everyone's mind. We're then going to walk away from the theater and we've been changed. We've been indoctrinated or initiated or whatever, based on what we've just seen. We've taken in this information, and even if we say, well, I don't really believe it, or I disagree with this or that, we've still been affected by it, whether we know it or not. And then we go and, our actions may be altered on the basis of what we've seen in this or that film. So that's another big aspect of what's going on here. And you'll actually see certain directors, especially the big ones. It's always the big names, David Lynch and Kubrick, Spielberg, so forth, that do this. I might add that if you read Dave McGowan's book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, you'll note that Steven Spielberg grew up in Laurel Canyon with all the other military intelligence CIA kids that were, basically going to be the founders of the counterculture or the hippie movement.
Wow, I did not know that. There is a line of thinking out there that reality is an illusion, and that we create reality based on our thoughts. And the elite, quote unquote elite, I hate to use that word because these people are really cockroaches when it comes down to it. But the elite understand this, and thus they use predictive programming to put something in the consciousness of mankind on a mass scale, and thus create that outcome just by putting it out there and having everybody focus on it.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't believe that reality is merely a construct of our psyche, or that our minds merely create reality or something like that. That would be, in philosophy, what's called solipsism. And I think that's a very dead-end philosophy to go down. A lot of philosophers have gone down that track. People like Descartes, that's where that philosophy kind of ends in that perspective. And this would be similar to what you see in, say, Far Eastern religions, where the ideas that the external world or the phenomena of my experience are simply phantasms or illusions. I don't think the external world is real. I believe that there's an external objective world that we all share in common. However, it is at the same time true that our mind is very powerful, and more so than most of us tend to think. And it does have the tendency to, at least on an individual level, like say, if I am convinced that, I don't know, of some sort of taboo or something very strange, like, sexuality, for example, is evil. You see this in a lot of, say, fringe religious cults. then I'm most likely to operate the rest of my life with that perspective, and I might develop this or that neuroses or something like that based on this foundational belief that I have. So in other words, even though it may not be real in the external world that, sexuality is like inherently evil or something, if I have that perspective, I'm going to operate that way. So what I think is the majority of what's going on is what's called perception management, which is just the idea that, if Katy Perry goes into the Super Bowl and she's lifted up and she's portrayed as a goddess with a bunch of theatrics and smoke and mirrors, it doesn't really matter whether she is or is not a goddess, because of course she's just a human being, if she can get the perspective of most of those in the audience to treat her that way. So as some of the esoteric writers say, does it really matter if if you're really a god or not, if you can get everybody to treat you like a god, because pragmatically at that point you are a god. And so that's kind of, I think, the more pragmatic approach of what's going on from the perspective of the so-called elite and the social engineers and so forth.
Well, the idea that we're our own God, that resonates with me. It does. It feels like truth. Mm. But I don't go down the line of religion at all, or that there's a heaven and hell, et cetera, et cetera. I think I believe a lot in karma, that whatever we put out, we're eventually going to get back, and it's more of an evolution as we climb this ladder of consciousness to get back to source, or whatever the case may be. But what is the point of putting this agenda out? Because to me, that understanding empowers me, and it makes me break through a lot of the constructs of the Matrix. But I imagine the elite would not want people to break out of the Matrix.
I don't think that from the perspective of the so-called elite, they really care. In one sense, they care in that, they don't want other people in their club, I guess you could say. But I think they view it from the perspective of long-term historical analysis. So they would look at, civilization studies as something that a lot of, your big-time academics and famous writers like Spangler or Toynbee or people like this, H.G. Wells, they've spent a lot of time studying civilizations, and so they try to look at the big picture, and they're not really concerned with any kind of populism or mass uprising or anything like that. They know that the masses are going to pretty much stay in the state of, cattle-like obeisance as they have for most of history. So I don't think they're really worried about it, but at the same time, they do have to consistently put into practice, all the techniques of dysgenics and dumbing people down and subliminals and so forth, mind control, full spectrum subversion, as my buddy Mark Hackard calls it. So that is going on, but I don't think that they're worried that anybody's going to jump into the ranks of the elite and dethrone them simply because they've been at this for so many generations. And from their perspective, it's really based on bloodlines and genealogies and divine right and things like that, and having the in their mind the divine mandate to rule the earth, right, to be gods on earth. So pragmatically speaking, I don't think they're shaking in their boots or worried or anything like that, because revolution, historically speaking, doesn't really tend to fare very well. Revolutions don't do much. They really, in my view, function to benefit some other foreign power. So if you have a revolution in some country like France, probably what's going on is that another rival group, the British or somebody, are actually funding that revolution to weaken the existing nation. So revolutions and revolutionary philosophies and so forth, I don't think have much, they don't achieve much, except most of the time they make things worse. So, look at communism or Marxism. Anytime there was a revolution, things got progressively worse in those nations. Anyway, but back to film in Hollywood. I think that it's out there in the films because that's kind of, if you look at the way liturgy or rituals work, that's kind of the preparatory stage. Is you mimic, you do an anamnesis, remembrance, and then you prepare for what's to come in miniature at the beginning. And I think that that's one of the main reasons that everything is put out there. It's also kind of like a test almost. It's like, well, we're going to show you ahead of time what we're going to do, and you're either stupid enough to not figure it out, or you're going to figure it out and act appropriately.
Wow, absolutely fast. Ladies and gentlemen, don't go anywhere. We've got a quick break, but we've got more from Jay Dyer right on the other side.
The system microphone is now muted for break.
Truth Frequency Radio is your #1 source for news and information without the hate, hype, and fear. We are proud to bring you cutting-edge programs like Strange World with Mark Sargent, Jeranism Raw with Jared and Mizza, Truth Frequency with Chris and Sherry Geo, The Kev Baker Show, X Square with Brooks Agnew, Freaky Friday with The Woo Crew, Perceptions Talk Radio with Jonathan, The Freedom Link with Joe Joseph, Phoenix Rising Radio, and dozens more. Did you know you can listen from any computer, mobile device, or from any telephone by dialing 832-225-5308 or call into your favorite show toll-free at 866-37-TRUE. Uncensored talk and news you won't hear in the mainstream media. 24 hours a day. Truth Frequency Radio. Wherever you are, make it TFR. Truth Frequency Radio.
For over 3,000 years, we've been in the background, controlling governments from behind the scenes and creating a new world order. However, we are losing the war, and we need your help. Join the Illuminati now. Travel the world injecting poor brown-skinned people with vaccines. Steal their oil and their gold. Or perhaps you'd like a job as a farmer, growing genetically modified corn, which we make into oil and sell it with no label. Or if you've ever wanted to be a pilot, you could join our chemtrails project. You'd be in the air all the time then. Oh yes, it's time to join the Illuminati. Oh, and don't forget to like us on Facebook.
Visualize an infinite hologram of unconditional love above your head. This is a holographic sphere with the flower of life pattern infinitely expanding inwardly to infinity.
The all-new Sacred Geometry Shop has arrived, featuring 8 of the world's most renowned sacred geometry and visionary artists. The mission of SGS is to embed sacred geometry art, frequencies, and equations into all conventional products in order to raise the vibration and help heal one's own individual life. Products include art, canvas prints, skateboards, Galaxy and iPhone cases, clothing, hats, jewelry, home decor, yoga mats, and a new sacred geometry skincare line. Enter the word STARSEED for an additional 25% discount. Log on today to sacredgeometryshop.com and feel the vibration.
Real Politics with Professor James Tracy. Mondays on Truth Frequency Radio.
Attention host. The system microphone will be live in 3, 2, 1.
Now, Jay, you've cleared up a lot of things for me, particularly the goddess symbolism that we saw Katy Perry doing, for instance. Madonna also did the same thing. Because to me, when I really start to examine, and again, I come from a Gnostic perspective, when I start to examine the goddess, I start to go down the line of the divine feminine, the sacred feminine, something that religions have been trying to oppress and something that actually empowers people and empowers the world as well, because we are completely off balance. On one side, you have the masculine energy, which is the war and defend yourself and get resources, et cetera, and then you have the feminine energy, which is the nurturing and loving. And we're as a society, in my opinion, we're completely devoid of the feminine energy. And that's why we've created a world that we've created now in this day and age. But to herald the goddess like that seems to be contrary to their agenda, which is order out of chaos. But you've really cleared that up. It's not necessarily that they're heralding the goddess. It's more of they're putting themselves in the place of that goddess. the one world religion is something a lot of people are worried about and a lot of people are concerned about. I happen to believe that religion is one of the most divisive mechanisms that there is, and so it goes against the idea of order out of chaos, or even the idea of maintaining control, because divide and conquer, that's what it's all about. But could Gnosticism be the one world religion, and could that be the reason why they're putting Gnosticism out there so heavily?
Now, that's an interesting question. I think that from the perspective of the establishment, you could go back to something like the Roman Empire and look at how that functioned, and you get a picture, I think, of how the globalist view of what to do with religion would work. And so it's not necessarily that there's like one correct view from their vantage point to where they want to take things. It's rather that to control men, what you need is whatever works. And so it's more of a pragmatic thing, I think, from the perspective of, social engineers and technocrats and people at the Rockefeller Foundation and so forth. It's all about what works. And so what works is whatever might be a trend, and you might pick up a trend, like, say, I think the New Age movement was something, for example, that was engineered and put into play with money from places like the Rockefeller Foundation and so forth. And the goal there is not so much, we've got to, overthrow the feminine with, masculine reason or something, but rather it's whatever is seen to be pragmatic in terms of changing the culture in the practical way you want to take it. So one of the reasons that I think they promoted feminism and the rise of, the goddess and goddess worship and all that is not so much to actually exalt the feminine, but rather to put forth an inverted version of these things in order to wreck things. So you can use an inverted version. This is where we get back to that voodoo and black magic aspect of it. You can invert a thing to destroy a thing. And so the way that things are oftentimes controlled or known is by their name, right? And so if you can rename a thing and associate that name with the inversion of the thing, then you've disempowered or dethroned the truth about that thing, right? So if a woman is at one time viewed to be XYZ, then if you can put out this image or this archetype of, Brittany going from the sweet teen girl, or Miley from the sweet teen girl to the whore who's like sucking on snakes on stage or something, then what you've got is the inversion of what is the image of a female. And I think that it's done from the perspective of social engineering and technocrats and psyops masters to wreck the culture, so that from the wrecked culture you can impose a new order, which Huxley described in Brave New World as the new order of the ages, the final revolution.
The final revolution. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, in Brave New World, you have an interesting presentation of what Huxley said would be the result of the previous century's revolutions. So I mentioned earlier in passing the French Revolution, which was probably engineered on the part of British intelligence agents. But that's generally what we think of in terms of the modern world, in terms of revolutionary philosophy. It goes back to Adam Weishaupt, and it goes back to the French Revolution. And many of the French revolutionaries were influenced by Weishaupt's Illuminism. And if you read what Weishaupt actually said, it wasn't like Satanism or something like this. It was actually scientific rationalism. And what he said was that we need reason, we need rationalism to erect a communistic society. So Weishaupt's Illuminism is the founding document, ultimately, of communism. And you can trace this lineage through figures like Antonio Gramsci in Italy, the French revolutionaries in France, the Grand Orient Lodge of France and Italy, up through people like Buonarroti, and then you get to the modern world, basically with Grand Orient Masonry at large. And I would argue ultimately that that's probably controlled by British Masonry, but there's this appearance at least of a difference between Eastern and Western Masonry. Regardless, the philosophy is ultimately revolutionary. And so you would see so many revolutions, in the last couple hundred years that would happen across the globe, where you would have monarchs dethroned and supposedly rational republics put in their place. And these rational republics were, generally speaking, Masonic revolutions. If you look at the revolution in Mexico, for example, it was all done at the behest of Masonic lodges. The same with Latin and South American revolutions as well. Now, did this actually achieve freedom and democracy? I would argue no, that the Masonic republics are really fronts for the real Illuminati, which would be, run out of the City of London and Oxford University and so forth. So that's, I think, the inner party, and that's what Huxley is talking about when he talks about the final revolution being achieved by this inner party of British strategists that, thinkers that would come out of the Fabian Society and different elite think tanks in the UK. And they're really who, steer the ship, so to speak, of the New World Order. And that's what Huxley says in his interviews. If you watch interviews with him at Berkeley, he says, I'm not telling, what I'm telling you in Brave New World is, of course, the future, but you're not going to oppose it. You're all going to, of course, go along with it because you're too stupid to understand what I'm saying. That's actually what he says in that lecture.
Wow.
He tells the whole audience of Berkeley, he's like, well, of course, I'm telling you what's going to happen, but you're too stupid to know. And there's a great introductory essay in Brave New World where Huxley says, what I'm telling you in Brave New World is the future. This is where we're going to take you. And it's the culmination of the previous revolutions. You see, you thought that the revolutions from France and so forth on were to make you free. Oh no, he says, they were not to free you. They were to fool you and to make you think you were free so that you would actually accept more tyranny than what you had under the monarchies.
Wow. It seems like that's what's going on right now in the United States with the police brutality. I mean, that's highlighted by the mainstream media. Obviously, there's an agenda.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. I think that the Brave New World, that is America, because it's taken from the play The Tempest by Shakespeare, which is about the New World. And I think that Huxley was intentionally choosing that term on purpose to say, as we learn from Sir Francis Bacon, the new Atlantis is the new continent, America, and America is who the Hermeticists and so forth would transform into this magical island, right? That's what you see in The Tempest, is this magical island that's run by a wizard, Prospero. And that's what America is. It's a land of illusion. And in fact, I think if you look at The Tempest, it's actually pretty sagacious in its foresight, because it shows that this mystical island, which aka the U.S. or London, either way, the U.K. is an island, right? It's actually, that is the land of magical illusions, right? We live in a Disneyland.
It is. And they have everybody hopped up on something, Xanax, Prozac, whatever the case is.
Which Huxley said in 1932 is how it would be. Everybody would be on pharmaceuticals.
Yes, I remember a quote from him, something to the effect of, if you can put a person in what would otherwise be unreasonable circumstances and have them be happy, then you have total control.
Yes, he says, in fact, that the techniques of hellfire and brimstone preachers, believe it or not, would be used by the state. He says that in that lecture, he says that the state would take the techniques of hellfire brimstone preachers and turn it into basically the war on terror. So all of these things that Huxley's talking about back in the 30s, he wrote Brave New World in 1932, and I believe the Berkeley lecture is 1954 or so. All of these techniques that he's talking about is what you would see the British establishment put into practice through its legates in Hollywood and so forth, like Ian Fleming and et cetera, et cetera.
It's hard to tell what kind of future they actually have planned. At least right now in 2016, it seems split between a 1984 scenario and a Brave New World scenario, maybe borrowing from both scenarios, but there is brute force, total control, surveillance, et cetera, et cetera. Is that just a means to an end, or is that where we're ultimately heading?
Well, the end result is also in Brave New World, where you have a completely genetically modified population of the future that's severely reduced. So all the members, of course, of that British establishment feel that the Earth is a living organism that can only support a certain number of people. Hence, they've always promoted Malthusianism. So the idea is, of course, that the population has to be reduced significantly. Everybody knows about the Georgia Guidestones and so forth. But the idea is also not just to get rid of most people, but to create to finish the great work, which is the perfecting of nature, which is to create smart cities or smart world. That's the end result is transhumanism.
And total control.
And it's the
because once you plug in,
yeah, it's the Huxleys that coined the term transhumanism, by the way.
I didn't know that. Once you plug in, that's it. They have complete control over you. I mean, that's why cash, in my opinion, is so important, because they turn off your chip, they turn off your card, whatever, and that's it. It doesn't matter who you are, you're under their control.
Yeah, Bertrand Russell, one of his colleagues, said, even before Huxley, he said, in the future, we'll give you a bunch of credits that will be put into your account. And if you don't use up your credits, they go away at the end of the week. And what that would do is train people to just be mindless consumers. So we already have the initial stages of that with, of course, with credit cards and electronic banking. But yes, most of the aspects in the so-called conspiracy world that you see people talking about in terms of the tech tyranny and the tech takeover, that's the most accurate aspect of all this. Most of that tends to be pretty accurate and pretty correct. And I talk a lot about that at my site. I deal with a lot of film series that I think have told us where we're going, particularly in terms of the tech arena. And that would be films like AI by Spielberg. It would be films like 2001, Kubrick, right? I have an analysis of that as well. The Terminator series, James Cameron, all of these were telling us where we go with Skynet and all these types of. It really is creating a global grid, and that's the ultimate prison that we're going to be headed towards.
And it's really a shame, because the technology itself isn't evil. I mean, if we can help paraplegics walk again, if we can help people who need a heart, who need an arm, et cetera, then by all means we should be doing it. But it's going to lead to a place of tyranny.
Well, it's always sold that way, right? Like the military comes on and says, oh, DARPA has developed an arm that's a bionic arm, and it's going to be for all of the soldiers who had their arm blown off at the behest of the government to begin with, right? But no, that's not ultimately what these things are for. They're not for, I mean, do you think you're going to sign up for Obamacare and go like get a bionic arm or a bionic, I mean, you're not going to get like a, robot dick when you sign up for Obamacare, and you're not getting it. It's for, children of the billionaires. That's who's going to get this kind of stuff, right? So that's just the basic manipulation that we were talking about at the beginning, where things are put out in this emotional, pretty packaging, and people are duped into thinking, oh, that's for me. I'm a part of this. Yes, I'm going to, be a part of the transhumanist, the transition era where we go into the new type 1 civilization or whatever. That's not what that's not for you. It's all what they want for you is death.
Well, and I hate to say it, but Huxley was right when he said, I'm going to tell you the agenda and you're too stupid, you're still going to fall for it. Yep. We saw everybody with the Obama phones, for instance. Next, it's going to be the Obama chip, and everybody's going to celebrate the Obama chip. Look, I got my free chip from Obama, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe not Obama, I'm just being facetious with that. But I think you know where I'm going with it.
Yes. Again, there's so many films that I think have told us what to expect. You could, even especially some of these bizarre 70s films like Zardoz with Sean Connery, the John Borstein film, or Logan's Run, the weird film with Michael York. Both of these are dystopian sci-fi films, and they all present the exact type of future that we're going into, where the mass population has been dumbed down and killed off with dysgenics. You have AI running everything. You even have things like euthanasia, where, the idea in Logan's Run is that once you hit age 30, it's time to die. And they have this nice little pretty flower ceremony where you float off into this thing that zaps the shit out of you, and then you're incinerated, right? And so that's what they would like to erect. It's the worst nightmare of any kind of, it's like the worst aspects of capitalism and communism combined into Brave New World with Mickey Mouse on the package.
Wow. So what is the solution? To me personally, that's why I go down the route of consciousness, because I think that is the key. As you said earlier, revolution can be staged. You can have a French Revolution scenario where they bring in their own power controllers after the fact. Power structure, that's the term I was looking for. So like these people in Oregon, I commend them for what they're doing, and I commend their heart 100%, but it seems kind of futile at this point to sit on horses with rifles against these huge machines, tanks, and satellite technology, et cetera, et cetera. So that's definitely not the answer, not in 2016, but the elevation of consciousness, evolution of consciousness, because if we don't raise the consciousness, then we're just going to replace the power structure with the exact same thing, that the exact same kind of mentality, and we're just going to get caught in this never-ending cycle. So to me, that is the answer on a personal level, but we really need something on a mass level. Any speculations as to what the answer is?
Well, I've written a couple essays that I think you would like or readers would like, and this is the kind of stuff that'll be in my book, where I try to offer what I think are the solutions to this problem. And one of the problems that we deal with that is so fundamental is that of dialectics, and this goes back to ancient philosophy. And I do a lot of lectures and so forth in ancient philosophy where I talk about the ancient philosophers trying to deal with these same problems and issues in their day. And one of the problems, as I said, is dialectics, and that is the idea that everything can be simplified and polarized into this or that thing, and that we have to choose a lot of either-or options that are already given to us prepackaged as traps by the establishment. So the first thing I would say is, like basic critical thinking and things like that, and the laws of logic, and then getting past dialectics. And so if you look at that essay that I did, Dialectics, Man's Metaphysical Problem, I present several solutions there as to how we get past this era. I would say of scientism is really the dominant philosophy of our day, which teaches empiricism, this idea that we only know what's available to our immediate five senses. And this is really an idea that comes from the Enlightenment and so forth, the scientific revolution. And this, I think, is really what's trapped us, because it keeps us into thinking that materialism is all there is, that we're all simply and only matter. So I would say some of those essays that I've written that deal with that point in the right direction, as well as if you read some of the perennialists, like René Guénon has a famous essay where he deals with the modern world, critiquing it. Those are some essays that I think point in the right direction.
And you mentioned your books, too. Where can people pick those up, and any one that you would point people to? Right.
Well, I would say that if you like what you've heard, I do weekly interviews and talks on this, and you can subscribe at Jay's Analysis to my talks at the PayPal thing there. My book is forthcoming. It's called Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film. And what I do is I take a different approach to film analysis. It's not like Roger Ebert, and it's not like it's not like a Hollywood scandal book. It's more like, let's take each one of these individual films, like The Matrix, like AI, like Kubrick or whatever, and let's go through this film and see what the deeper meanings are, to give people a better perspective as to how to approach cinema, because everybody loves movies. They're always going to be watching movies. But what I try to do is give the keys to understand what's really going on, to avoid being programmed. So you can go to Jay's Analysis and you'll see my there's a click there. You can go to Amazon and pre-order my book, which will be out in June.
And you mentioned J.J. Abrams a couple of times, and you can't mention his name without, of course, mentioning Star Wars. Mm-hmm. Have you seen the latest film, and have you been able to decode any of the esoteric symbolism within it?
I did see the latest film, and of course I grew up loving Star Wars, and I've done a few shows where we talked about this, where there's all kinds of strange Kabbalistic ideas in Star Wars, I think, that can be pulled out, particularly with the notion of Yod, which is the smallest letter in the Hebrew alphabet. And of course, the Kabbalah deals intimately with the notion of the Hebrew letters having an actual mystical and magical significance. And I think that the good principle of wisdom is interesting, that he's Yod, which is, it's not only the smallest letter of the alphabet, it's also the 10th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And 10 is interesting because in the Kabbalistic symbolism, it's the first 10 sayings of Genesis, right? When God says, let there be light, and so forth. There's 10 of those. And then the next time that God speaks in a significant way is at Mount Sinai, where he gives 10 commandments. And so I think Spielberg is showing us Lucas, but I think Spielberg consulted on Star Wars. With Yoda, you have the idea of the divine wisdom giving forth, the good side of things, if you will. And that's a big part of it. You also have interesting hints at transhumanism, all the way back to, Darth Vader himself basically being a cyborg. So there's no doubt that George Lucas, working from his consultation, I think, with Joseph Campbell on that film, and Joseph Campbell is a big student of Carl Jung, basically just watered down Carl Jung. I think that's really what's going on with Star Wars, is it's kind of an alchemical, mythical tale in a Jungian archetypal sense, a space opera.
That is pretty much the way I decoded it as well, and a lot of the Gnostic symbolism as well. The Kabbalah, to my understanding, it was basically taken or borrowed or stolen from Egyptian mysticism. I noticed a lot of the symbols, Metatron's cube, for instance, which is the tree of life, the flower of life or the seed of life. It's basically from ancient Egypt. Have you found those correlations?
Absolutely. You know, I have a bunch of essays on Egyptology and these very topics that you're discussing. And you can search my site for those if you're interested. But there's a similar, when I mentioned perennialism earlier, perennial philosophy, and people like Rene Guénon, they write a lot on this notion. And it's about the correlations that we see between the Babylonian theology, the Egyptian theology, the Greek theology, and so forth. And what they do is point out these sort of fundamental maxims or patterns that run throughout these different cultures and their different religious philosophies and theologies. And what you see is that there's a pretty consistent idea of who the tetrad is, with the tetractys, right, the 10 principal deities. And that would match up, of course, to the Sephirot of the Kabbalistic tree of life. And so I think that the tree of life, that matches up with the Nordic notion of Yggdrasil, the tree that is the whole universe, and so forth. And this, you see these same ideas in Plato with the universe being a kind of cosmic man. And so all of these ideas are the same. They're all connected, and there is I think a perennial tradition from which they all derive, be it Egypt, be it whatever. And so I do think that the Kabbalah is kind of a syncretistic blending of Neoplatonism, Babylonian magic, and so forth.
Fascinating. And we only have about 2 minutes left, but I've got to ask this question. Going back to Egypt, going back to all of these places, what would you say is the origin of all of this knowledge? Is it extraterrestrials?
No, well, I generally take the view that what we call extraterrestrial and the origin of this kind of knowledge is actually if you read the Book of Enoch, I think that's pretty accurate. So there's a fallen series of hierarchies from the angelic realm, and they have natural knowledge. This would be why, for example, a lot of voodoo or Santeria cults would be focused on animism and nature worship, is because these spirits were connected with the governance of the universe, which is actually what Ezekiel says in that section about the wheels in Ezekiel 9. And so the fallen angels from the celestial hierarchy they followed the serpent into rebellion, and so they retained a lot of the knowledge that they have of natural workings of nature and creation. And so the body of tradition that we call perennialism, I think, originates from them. And so the ancient rituals that they enacted, the mysteries, so to speak, are the rites of the fallen angels, and they do actually encode the secrets of nature, and that's what DARPA and these different tech companies do when they, come up with all this advanced, transhumanist biological modification technology, is that it actually is based on ancient alchemical techniques that come from the fallen angels.
Fascinating. We've got to do a show on that sometime in the very near future. Jay, thank you so much for your time this evening. This has been great. Give us your websites one more time, please.
Yeah, jaysanalysis.com, and if you like what you hear, just help me out, support my show by subscribing at the PayPal link there, and you get interviews and talks and lectures that I do on philosophy and the esoteric.